It was a fictional exploration into what the world would be like if a number of people had had an experience like that and it had changed them. And I assumed that it would stay fictional. Which leads me to the next question. How beautifully timed. Did you even think that your book, or did you ever think that your book would go as far as it did when you started? No, never. I never imagined any of this. I was actually a very underpublished author at the time. This was only my third published book, and my first two were with very small presses and did not sell a lot of copies because small press books don't sell a lot of copies. And so actually my dream when I was writing this was, please let me see it in a bookstore. That was all I really asked. Just one time, let me see a copy of it in a bookstore. I really did not expect, I think I had a little bit of a little unrealistic fantasy in the back of my head that people might just play at this just a little bit, that I'd see that maybe somebody would send me a little news clipping of somebody who really paid it forward after they read the book or after they saw the movie. And I go, look, somebody tried out my idea. So to see if that would really happen, I made up one of those Google News alerts so that I get any news stories about anybody who really was paying it forward. And as of my speaking to you here today, I get one of those a day, and most of them have somewhere between 4 and 7 news stories per day of someone who's out there paying it forward. Could have knocked me over with a feather. What was my favorite part of the book? That's an interesting question. I have to think about that a little bit. I think my favorite part of the book, and it's really too bad that all the things I liked best didn't make it into the movie, almost without exception. You know, at the scene at the end where they're having a kind of a candlelight march and they're honoring Trevor and kind of coming together and deciding if this is something that they really want to do as a society, if they're serious about this, if they really are going to pay it forward. And people start, as my heroes, Reuben and Arlene, are walking down the street, people are reaching out to them and saying, I will, which is kind of like their commitment, that they're going to do it. There's a moment when they pass a mounted policeman. They pass a cop on a horse, and they look up at him, and he looks down at them. Now, I think the expectation at that moment is that he's just there to control the crowd. You know, he's not part of the crowd. He's just there to make sure the crowd doesn't get out of control. He looks down at Reuben and Arlene when they go by, and he says, I will. Because at that moment, he's not just there as a cop. At that moment, he's a human being, and he can make the commitment too. I think if I had to choose one part of the book, that might be my favorite part. Okay, and I think I talked about where the inspiration came from. I'll say one more thing about that. That is a common question. I will say that almost any time I write a book, it's because I have a burning question in my mind. And it's usually a question about how we are as people and who we are as people. And it's usually a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Because if it had an easy answer, I wouldn't get 300 pages out of it. Now, I don't write the book thinking I can answer this question, because again, it's going to be a pretty deep, unanswerable question. I think I go into a novel curious about why we are a certain way. And I think what I want is for the reader to ask the question with me, so that maybe we can open a dialogue about a thing like that. So here was my question that made me want to write Pay It Forward. If we all want to live in a kinder world, and it's very easy to be kinder, why don't we just do it? Why doesn't somebody just start? Were any of your characters based on people in your own life? Not really. They really are all fictional. And I really want to make a point about that because when your family and friends think that you're putting your family and friends in your books, they start acting very strangely. Or they disappear entirely, depending on how much self-confidence they have. I really do make these people up, and when I'm done writing these characters, I look at them and I say, where did this guy come from? Where did this woman come from? Because they're not really anybody that I know. But sometimes I'll borrow things from real life and write it into a character. Like, for example, The reason, and it's interesting this is Veterans Day, so good day to talk about this, as long as it's Veterans Day. The reason I made him a Vietnam vet, that was kind of my era. I was a little bit young for that, but generally the boys of my generation would go off and get wounded or killed in Vietnam. And I knew two Vietnam vets as an adult very well. Quite a time after the war was over, maybe 20 years after the war was over, I knew these two men. They both had something in common. They were severely scarred, but on the inside. Like one of them could only sleep for 2 or 3 hours at a time, because if you got too deeply into a dream state, the nightmares would come back. And they would try to tell people that they still weren't healed from this war 20 years ago, and people would just dismiss it completely. They would say, buddy, that was a long time ago, move on with your life. Well, it's not 20 years ago when you're still living with the scars. So that's why I made Reuben a Vietnam vet with his scars on the outside, right in your face, so that nobody would dare look at Reuben and say, buddy, the war was a long time ago. Not for him, it wasn't. Not when he has to face that reaction every time somebody meets him for the first time. So a thing like that you can borrow from somebody, and speaking of which, that's another thing that didn't make it into the movie, was Reuben being, well, Reuben didn't make it into the movie, but anyway. That's the way you can kind of borrow a little piece of something from a person you really know, but then by the time you write it into your story, it doesn't make that a real character, because I really did make Reuben up.